The train slid into Rome as though it carried not just passengers, but entire centuries pressed into its wheels. When I stepped out into the station, the air struck me with a force I hadn't felt since Barcelona. Different, denser, infused with sun-warmed stone, the tang of garlic clinging to the streets from late dinners, the sharp bite of exhaust from Vespas weaving recklessly through traffic. Paris had been a sigh. Rome was a roar. The moment I crossed the threshold of the station, I felt the hum of voices, the echo of horns ricocheting against facades older than memory, and somewhere, far away, the low toll of church bells as though marking not just the hour, but my arrival. Dragging my suitcase across uneven cobbles, I felt like I was moving through a living painting. Shadows clung to the corners of alleys, but every opening burst with light and life. Restaurants spilled onto the streets, tables pressed tightly together, red checked cloths stained with wine and oil. Waiters navigated the chaos with ease, trays balanced high, their shouts in Italian sharp, but never unkind. The air carried everything at once. Simmering tomatoes, sweet gelato, smoke from roasted chestnuts, the faint mineral scent of stone fountains. Rome didn't ease me into its rhythm. It swept me into the current immediately. I turned a corner, and the chaos broke open into a piazza I couldn't yet name. It unfolded around me like a secret finally revealed. Wide and generous, paved in stone, polished by centuries of footsteps, it seemed to breathe. At its heart, a fountain sparkled under the lamps, the spray catching the night air in silver arcs that drifted like mist. Children still played, chasing pigeons, though it was far past bedtime, their squeaks echoing off the marble. Couples leaned close on the steps, their gelato melting faster than they could eat it. On the fountain's edge, a violinist bent into his music, bow trembling across strings, the melody stitched together from fragments of sorrow and joy. I lowered my suitcase and sat on the worn stone rim of the fountain. My body ached from travel, but Rome refused to let me rest passively. Here, rest meant immersion. The fountain splashed against my back, voices swirled around me, and I realized that no one in this piazza was a stranger. Everyone belonged simply by showing up. The rhythm wasn't in the music alone. It was in the echo of laughter, in the murmur of conversations, in the click of heels on stone. The piazza was alive. Not in bursts, but in a steady heartbeat that had pulsed through nights like this for centuries. An old man passed by, a wicker basket of roses looped over his arm. He stopped by a laughing couple, placing a bloom gently into the woman's hand with a flourish. A group of students sprawled across the steps, sharing pizza straight from the box, their gestures wide, their voices rising in unison. From a balcony above, someone shouted in Italian, and the crowd below answered with equal cheer, the exchange echoing until even the statues seemed to smirk at the noise. Saints, angels, emperors carved in stone. They had watched over centuries of nights like this. And tonight, I was folded into their gaze. I reached for my notebook, pulling it from my bag, but when I opened it, the page stared back blankly, mocking my attempt. What words could hold this? Rome wasn't a city you captured in ink. It was the city you surrendered to. A rhythm, a chorus, a tide. I closed the book again, letting my fingers rest against the cover, and allowed myself to listen. Midnight approached, but the square did not empty. If anything, it swelled. The fountain's voice grew louder as the crowd pressed closer. A man appeared with a guitar, strumming chords that clashed joyfully with the violin. A group began to clap in time, the rhythm infectious, until even I found my hands striking against my knees, my breath falling into the cadence. The Piazza demanded participation. To sit silently was impossible. I laughed aloud, surprising myself with how natural it felt, how quickly I'd been absorbed. Rome did not care who I was, where I had come from, or where I was going next. It cared only that I was here, that my voice joined the chorus, that my body leaned into the rhythm of stone, water, and air. This was not tourism. This was communion. Leaning back, I tilted my head to the night sky. The stars shimmered faintly above the glow of lamps, the kind of light that reminded me that beauty could exist both above and below, infinite, yet immediate. My eyes stung with exhaustion, but I didn't want to leave the square. Rome had found me, and it refused to let me remain a spectator. And somewhere inside that realization, a thought stirred. Tomorrow, I would be moving again, northward, into the silence of mountains, into the promise of Switzerland. But tonight, in Rome's midnight piazza, I understood why the journey needed both fire and stillness, noise and quiet. The morning in Rome greeted me with light that felt ancient, as though it had touched these stones for millennia before ever finding me. Sunlight spilled across the cobblestones, revealing every crack and crease, every scar left by centuries of footsteps. The city was already awake, not rushing, but alive in its own rhythm. Vespas buzzed like bees through narrow alleys, horns honked without anger, and the air smelled of espresso and bread pulled fresh from ovens. I stepped into a cafe tucked into the corner of a street barely wide enough for two people to pass. Inside, the counter gleamed with brass, and the air was heavy with the hiss of steaming milk and the bitter perfume of ground coffee. I ordered a cappuccino, stumbling through my few words of Italian, but the barista smiled with amused kindness, sliding the cup across the counter. The foam was thick, crowned with cocoa, and the taste was sharp, then velvety, warming me from the inside out. At the bar, two old men argued over the sports section of a newspaper, their hands waving with the kind of passion only Italians seem capable of. I lingered longer than I meant to, just to listen, just to feel the music in their voices. Stepping back into the street, I wandered without a map. Rome unfolded itself like a labyrinth, and I was happy to be lost. Around one corner, a piazza opened wide, sun blazing against the facade of a church. Its doors stood open, shadows spilling into the square. I slipped inside, and the noise of the city vanished at once. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wax and stone. Candles flickered in clusters, their flames bending low as though whispering. Frescoes stretched overhead, saints gazing down with eyes both tender and stern. I sat in a pew for a moment, not to pray, but to breathe, to feel the weight of silence pressing against my skin. Back outside, Rome was unapologetically loud again. I followed the sound of water and found another fountain, not as famous as Trevi, but no less beautiful. Children leaned over the edge, tossing coins into the pool with solemn wishes, while their parents watched with indulgent smiles. I dropped a coin in myself, not for luck, but for memory. The splash echoed briefly, and I wondered how many stories lay buried beneath that water, waiting to be remembered. By midday, the heat settled heavy over the city. I ducked into a trattoria where the windows were thrown open to the street. The smell of garlic and tomato sauce drifted out in waves. I ordered pasta, simple and fresh, served with bread that cracked open to reveal steam. The waiter poured me a glass of red wine without asking, as if it was impossible to eat here without it. Around me, families crowded the tables, their conversations spilling into the street, laughter rising like birds into the air. A man at the next table noticed me writing in my notebook and asked me slowly in English where I was from.
We spoke in fragments, gestures filling the gaps, and by the end of the meal, I felt less like a tourist and more like a guest at someone's table. The afternoon carried me to the Colosseum. Its arches rose above me, fractured yet unbroken, its walls scarred but still proud. Tourists swarmed its edges, but I stood apart for a moment, imagining the roar of crowds long gone, the clash of steel, the dust rising under the Roman sun. Time felt thin here, as though the past might step forward at any moment and take my hand. I walked its perimeter slowly, tracing my fingers against stone worn smooth by centuries. As the lights softened, I found myself once again in a piazza, smaller this time, with a single tree shading its center. An accordion player sat beneath it, his notes weaving a melancholy tune. Children danced clumsily to the music, their joy transforming sadness into celebration. I sat on a bench, notebook balanced on my knees, and finally wrote, "Rome does not allow you to remain outside. It demands your voice, your presence, your laughter." And yet, even in that moment of belonging, I felt a tug, the thought of what lay ahead. Beyond Rome, the world would shift again. Switzerland waited quiet and steady, with its mountains and trains and silence that healed. Where Rome demanded immersion, Switzerland would offer retreat. One fire, one breath, one roar, one whisper. I closed my notebook and smiled, knowing the journey was leading me exactly where it needed to.
Evening in Rome descended not as silence, but as crescendo. The sun had barely dipped behind the terracotta rooftops when the city seemed to inhale deeply, then exhale all at once in a rush of voices, footsteps, and music. The air thickened with the scent of garlic and oregano, of pizza dough blistering in brick ovens, of sweet pastries cooling on trays behind fogged glass. From every doorway spilled sound, laughter, plates clattering, the scrape of chairs against stone. Rome didn't wind down with the setting sun. It came alive with a new intensity, a reminder that here, night was simply another stage for living. I wandered into Trastevere, its streets narrow and uneven, their cobbles glistening faintly from an earlier wash of rain. Lanterns swung gently above the alleys, their light golden against the fading blue of the sky. Families strolled together, grandmothers holding hands with grandchildren, their voices rising in warm conversation. Groups of young people leaned against walls with bottles of wine, arguing cheerfully, gesturing so broadly it seemed they might lift into the air. A man at the corner spun dough high above his head before laying it gently on a wooden paddle, sliding it into the fire. The heat escaped in a rush that kissed my face as I passed. The trattorias were overflowing, chairs pressed so close that strangers became neighbors. I found a seat at a small table tucked against the wall, its legs wobbling on uneven stone. The waiter was quick, decisive, recommending pizza margherita and pouring a glass of red wine before I could protest. When the food arrived, the crust was charred at the edges, soft in the middle, the cheese bubbling with olive oil. I ate with my hands, the taste bold and unapologetic, as though Rome itself had climbed onto the plate. Around me, conversations tangled together. Italian, English, German, a dozen languages blending into one single song of pleasure. A guitarist appeared, his voice rough but full, strumming songs that drew claps and whistles from the crowd. Children clambered onto the fountain steps, their faces sticky with gelato, their laughter carrying above the music. A young couple rose suddenly and began to dance, their movements improvised, their joy undeniable. The guitarist grinned, changing his rhythm to match their steps, and soon the entire piazza had turned toward them, cheering, clapping in time. I found myself clapping too, swept into the energy, my pulse racing faster than the beat of my hands. Later, I left the restaurant and followed the river. Along the Tiber, stalls had sprung up, selling trinkets, roasted nuts, painted masks, books with pages curling at the edges. Lights reflected off the water, shivering with every ripple. Groups gathered along the embankment, sitting in circles, passing bread, bottles, stories.
A girl with a violin stood on the edge of the quay, her bow moving fiercely, her face lit by the lamp behind her. The sound rose and carried across the river, haunting yet alive. I leaned against the stone wall, listening, feeling the music thread itself through the city like a second bloodstream. As the night deepened, the chaos didn't dim. It grew richer. The piazzas swelled with people. The fountains shone brighter. The air thickened with spice and smoke. Rome at night wasn't peaceful. It wasn't even romantic in the way Paris had been. It was urgent, demanding, glorious. A city that refused to let you watch quietly from the sidelines. You had to eat, to drink, to laugh, to move with it, or risk being left behind. When I finally returned to my room, my hair smelled faintly of smoke, my clothes of wine and bread. My notebook was heavy with scribbled fragments, none of them complete, but all of them pulsing with the rhythm of Rome. I sat by the open window, listening to the faint murmur of voices still rising from the street below, and realized I had not once felt alone all evening. Rome hadn't given me space to be lonely. It had filled every corner with its own heartbeat and demanded that I match it.
The next day in Rome began with the bells, not one, but many, tumbling over one another from towers scattered across the city. Their voices rose together, clashing and harmonizing all at once, as if the whole city wanted to remind me that time was sacred here, even when life seemed to spill beyond hours. I stepped out into the morning light, the cobblestones already warm beneath my shoes, and followed the sound of water. Every piazza in Rome seemed to hold a fountain, and each fountain told its own story. I began with the Trevi, drawn by the rush of voices that always surrounds it. The square was packed, tourists pressing close, coins flashing as they arced through the air and splashed into the pool. I watched for a while, letting myself be caught in the ritual. People tossed their coins with eyes squeezed shut, lips moving with private wishes. The fountain itself glittered under the sun. Statues carved with impossible detail, water spilling endlessly as though the city had tapped directly into eternity. I reached into my pocket and dropped a coin of my own, not so much for luck, but for remembrance. From there, I wandered to Piazza Navona, wide and generous, alive with painters and performers. Easels leaned in rows, canvases bright with images of the Colosseum, the Pantheon, portraits done in hurried strokes of charcoal. A mime moved silently through the crowd, his exaggerated gestures pulling laughter from children. At the far end of the piazza, another fountain roared, its figures twisting in motion, water spraying like applause. I sat at the edge of the square with a cup of espresso so small it vanished in 2 sips, and yet strong enough to send fire through my veins. Around me, voices overlapped in Italian, English, French, German, but the laughter was universal. By midday, the heat pressed heavily, and I ducked into the Pantheon. The rotunda swallowed me whole, its dome vast and solemn, the oculus above spilling a single shaft of light onto the marble floor. Dust floated in the beam like golden snow. People hushed their voices instinctively. Footsteps softened as if we all knew we were standing inside something larger than belief itself. I tilted my head back until my neck ached, staring into that perfect circle of sky, and thought about how strange it was that a building could make you feel both small and infinite at the same time. Later, I found myself in a smaller piazza, less crowded, where locals lingered over long lunches. The waiter brought me bruschetta topped with ripe tomatoes glistening in oil, followed by pasta so simple yet so perfect it made me smile. A group of workers sat at the next table, their laughter booming, their wine glasses raised again and again. One of them noticed me scribbling in my notebook and leaned over, asking, "Nonni americana?" I nodded, and soon they were offering me bites from their plates, insisting I try this sauce, that bread, this wine. Language failed us often, but it didn't matter. They made space for me at their table as though I'd always been there. The afternoon waned, and I climbed the Spanish steps, each one worn smooth by the weight of countless lives. At the top, the city stretched below me, domes and spires punctuating the horizon, the Tiber winding lazily through it all. I sat on the stone railing, sweat cooling on my skin, and felt Rome's immensity settle inside me. This was not a city you visited, it was a city you let consume you. As I descended, the bells tolled again, softer now, and I thought of what lay ahead. Beyond Rome, another rhythm waited, one that would not roar, but whisper. I pictured mountains rising against the sky, trains gliding along cliffs, silence so deep it would echo louder than any crowd. Switzerland. Where Rome demanded immersion, Switzerland would offer release. One fire, one stillness, one heartbeat pounding, the next slowing into calm. The thought made me smile. Travel was not about choosing between them, but about carrying both inside you.
By the time the sun dipped low, Rome had already shifted into another rhythm. The roar of the day softened into something more intimate, less like a parade and more like a conversation whispered between the streets and those who walked them. I left the wider boulevards behind and slipped into alleys that twisted like secrets. Laundries swayed from balconies above me, casting shadows against walls stained with centuries. Lamps flickered to life one by one, golden halos marking the path like breadcrumbs. The air was heavy with familiar scents: garlic, roasted meat, sweet basil bruised under the hands of cooks preparing for another night. Yet, in the smaller streets, the chaos eased. Here, neighbors leaned from windows to exchange words, a child balanced on a doorstep with a soccer ball at his feet, and cats prowled lazily, tails curling like punctuation marks in the dusk. I felt the city's pulse slowing, drawing me closer, inviting me to see its quieter face. I turned a corner and found a trattoria so small it could have been missed entirely. A single wooden sign hung above the door, its paint faded, its letters chipped. Inside, there were only 6 tables, each covered with simple cloth, the kind washed thin from years of use. The walls were plastered with photographs, families gathered at long tables, couples smiling with wine glasses raised, children caught mid-laughter. The air smelled of tomato sauce simmering low and steady, rich and familiar. The owner, a man with a weathered face and eyes that gleamed like polished walnut, greeted me without a word, only a nod that felt like recognition. He guided me to a corner table, placed a carafe of red wine before me, and disappeared back into the kitchen. I poured a glass, the wine dark and honest, and waited. When he returned, he set down a plate of bruschetta, the bread charred at the edges, the tomatoes glistening with oil, sprinkled with basil. I hadn't ordered, but he smiled as if to say, "This is what you need tonight." And when the main dish came, pasta served in a bowl so plain it could have been from any home kitchen, I realized he was right. The sauce clung thickly to the noodles, garlic and olive oil blooming together into something that felt both ancient and immediate. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, letting the flavors sink into me. As I lingered, the owner sat down at the next table with a glass of his own. He spoke little English, and my Italian was clumsy, but between gestures and laughter, we managed. He asked where I was from, how long I would stay, whether he liked my city. I told him honestly that Rome overwhelmed me, and he laughed, nodding as though to say, "That is the point." He told me about his family, the trattoria his father had opened, how every recipe had been passed down like an heirloom. His voice softened when he spoke of the years behind him, the joy and the struggle. Though I caught only fragments of his words, I understood enough. This trattoria was not just a place to eat. It was memory, devotion, love made tangible in sauce and bread. By the time I left, the night was deeper. The trattoria's windows glowed like a lantern against the dark street. I walked slowly, carrying the warmth of the meal and the kindness of the man with me. The larger piazzas still roared with music and fountains, but here, in the narrow veins of the city, Rome had shown me something else, its tenderness. As I reached my room and leaned out the window, listening to the hum of voices rise and fade, I realized that Rome was not only a city of spectacle, it was also a city of intimacy, of quiet corners where strangers became hosts, where food was a language stronger than words, where belonging was offered not with ceremony, but with bread and wine. And in that realization, my heart softened even more toward the city that had already claimed me.
Rome at night was nothing like the quiet trattoria I had left behind the evening before. As darkness deepened, the city shook off any pretense of calm and swelled into noise again, a different kind of music, one stitched from fountains, voices, and the thunder of Vespas cutting through narrow streets. The air was thick, alive, carrying scents that collided in waves. Wood smoke, frying dough, the sweetness of roasted chestnuts, the sharp tang of wine uncorked in the open. I began in Piazza Venetia, where the traffic roared around the great white monument, horns and engines echoing against its marble. From there, I let the night pull me forward, down streets that widened into squares bursting with life. Each piazza felt like a stage, its fountain the centerpiece, its crowd the actors. Street performers gathered where the lamplight was strongest, a fire breather drawing gasps from children, a juggler balancing bottles, a guitarist singing songs so raw his voice cracked but never faltered. I stopped at a stall where slices of pizza were sold on paper plates, the crust hot and blistered, the cheese stretching in strings with each bite. I ate standing by the fountain in Campo di Fiori, leaning against the cool stone while voices tangled around me. Tourists, locals, students, all pressed into the square as if drawn by the same invisible magnet. Laughter burst like fireworks, conversations rose and fell like waves, and still the fountain murmured steadily at the heart of it all. Further along, I turned into Piazza della Rotonda, where the Pantheon loomed in shadow. Its great columns glowed faintly under the lamps, its massive presence a reminder that time in Rome was layered, ancient and modern folded into one. The square pulsed with life, tables spilling from trattorias, waiters balancing trays of wine, children chasing pigeons through the crowd. I stood at the edge, sipping from a plastic cup of wine bought for €2, and felt how strange it was to drink cheap wine in the shadow of something eternal, to laugh with strangers beneath a dome that had seen empires rise and fall. It was here I met a girl leaning against the fountain, sketchbook open on her knees. Her pencil moved quickly, catching the curve of the Pantheon, the tilt of heads, the glow of lamps. She noticed me watching and smiled, holding up the page. The likeness was rough, but alive, full of movement. "For you," she said, in accented English, tearing the sheet free and handing it over. I tucked it carefully into my notebook, unable to stop smiling. A gift from the city itself, I thought, passed through her hands. The night carried me onward. At Piazza Navona, the fountains roared louder, water lit like fire under the lamps. Couples sat on the steps, sharing gelato, their lips sticky with sugar. Musicians played fast and fierce, their rhythms daring the crowd to move. I joined in the clapping, felt my palms sting with the repetition, my heart racing until I was laughing, breathless, part of the chaos. Even past midnight, Rome did not falter. Vespas still screamed through alleys, waiters still called from doorways, music still rose from every square. The city was insatiable, demanding, unwilling to rest. And I realized I didn't want it to. The noise filled every hollow in me, leaving no space for doubt or loneliness. Rome gave too much of itself for anyone to feel empty. When I finally returned to my room, the city still thrummed below, its heartbeat carrying into the walls. I laid the sketch on the desk, smoothing its edges, and stared at it for a long time. Rome wasn't finished with me yet, and I wasn't finished with Rome. The morning after Rome's clamor felt like waking in the aftermath of a celebration that had never truly ended. The city was quieter, but not silent, never silent. Instead, the sounds had softened. The murmur of brooms sweeping across cobblestones, the clink of cups in cafes, the hum of Vespas still threading the streets, though with less urgency than the night before. Sunlight spilled between the rooftops, catching on laundry strung high above, turning white shirts and bed sheets into flags of surrender to the new day. I wandered toward Piazza della Rotonda again, drawn back by the memory of the night. The square was almost unrecognizable in daylight. Where there had been wine and laughter, there were now families eating breakfast, shopkeepers arranging displays of postcards and scarves, children chasing pigeons with sticky fingers from fresh pastries. The Pantheon stood as it always did, solemn, unshaken, yet even it seemed gentler, its massive columns softened by the morning light. I sat at the edge of the fountain with a small espresso in hand. The bitterness wakened me faster than the sun ever could. I dipped the edge of a cornetto into the foam, the sweetness melting across my tongue, and felt the city slow with me. After breakfast, I wandered through narrow alleys that seemed calmer than the night before, yet no less alive. Bakers leaned out of doorways, their aprons dusted white, calling greetings to neighbors. A flower stall spilled color onto the street, the scent of roses and lilies mingling with the sharper bite of basil from a crate nearby. A cat stretched luxuriously in a patch of sun, its tails licking lazily as though it too was part of Rome's morning routine. I let myself drift without purpose until I stumbled into a courtyard I hadn't seen before. It was small, shaded, with ivy climbing the walls and a fountain murmuring softly at its center. An old woman sat on a bench feeding crumbs to pigeons, her hands steady, her smile faint but constant. She looked up as I passed, nodded once, and returned to her task. That nod felt like a benediction, as though Rome itself had acknowledged my presence. Later, I climbed the Capitoline Hill. From the terrace, the city spread below me in all directions, domes and towers piercing the skyline. The Colosseum crouched in the distance like a memory that refused to fade, the Tiber winding lazily through it all. The sun was higher now, painting everything in sharp relief, but even under its glare, the city seemed timeless, as if every stone had already endured enough to be beyond change. I leaned against the balustrade, notebook in hand, and wrote a single line. Rome does not rest, but it remembers how to breathe. As the day stretched on, I returned to my room for a moment of stillness. The sketch given to me the night before lay on the desk where I had left it. Its lines simple but alive. I traced them with my fingers, remembering the smile of the girl who had drawn it, the sound of fountains roaring behind her, the applause of strangers for music that wasn't perfect, but was real. Rome had a way of blurring nights into mornings, noise into silence, strangers into something more. When I leaned out of the window, the street below was humming again. Cafes filled with voices, waiters moved briskly with trays of coffee and juice, tourists craned their necks toward maps, and yet under it all, I felt the same intimacy as the night before, as though the city was whispering, "You are still part of this, even now, even in daylight." I smiled, realizing that Rome didn't demand constant movement. It allowed you to pause if you were willing to notice its softer face. And in that pause, I felt something I hadn't in days. Rest, not in silence, but in belonging. That night, Rome revealed yet another of its faces, not the deafening chorus of piazzas overflowing with voices, not the intimacy of hidden trattorias, but something in between. I wandered without a map, following the pulse of music and the scent of wine through streets that curved like questions. Lamps glowed against the stones, and the air was warm with the promise that something unexpected was waiting. I found myself in Piazza di Spagna, the Spanish steps gleaming under the floodlights. Crowds gathered on the wide staircase, some with gelato, others with bottles of wine cradled between their knees. Tourists snapped photographs, yes, but among them were locals sprawled comfortably, as though this marble belonged to them, which, in truth, it did. A guitarist perched near the fountain strummed lazily. His song carried more by atmosphere than skill, but no one seemed to mind. The music folded itself into the night, part of the fabric of the square. I bought a small cup of wine from a vendor at the corner and sat on the steps. The stone was cool under me, grounding, while the voices swirled overhead. Soon, a group of students sitting nearby noticed me scribbling in my notebook. One of them, a girl with a scarf tied around her hair, leaned closer and asked in English, "Writing about us?" Her smile was teasing, but her eyes were kind. I laughed, shaking my head, but the ice had already broken. They offered me a glass from their bottle, passing it down the line, and just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. Our conversation stumbled between English and Italian, filled with gestures, laughter, and the kind of energy only strangers meeting for the first time can bring. They asked me where I was from, what I had seen, what I thought of their city. I answered honestly that Rome felt less like a destination and more like a force, something that pulled you in whether you resisted or not. Their laughter rang out, proud and loud, as if I had said exactly the right thing. One of them, a boy with restless hands, told me about his dream of leaving Rome to Berlin to study music. Another confessed she had never thrown a coin into Trevi Fountain because she feared it would curse her to return when she wanted to see the world instead. Their words were half serious, half playful, but I could see the weight of youth in them. That yearning to belong everywhere at once, to live too many lives in a single lifetime. The wine passed back and forth, and the music shifted as another student borrowed the guitar, playing songs that made the group sing along loudly, off-key but joyous. I joined in where I could, humming when I didn't know the words, clapping when the rhythm demanded. At one point, I looked around, at the glowing steps, the fountain murmuring, the sky stretched dark and infinite above us, and thought, this is what it means to be absorbed into a city, not by monuments, but by moments. Hours slipped away without warning. The square thinned as families drifted home, but the students and I lingered, our voices softer now, our stories turning more personal. I told them of my travels so far, of Barcelona's fire, Paris's breath, and how Rome seemed to contain both at once. They listened intently, nodding, their eyes reflecting the lamps. One of them said quietly, "Rome always asks you to give yourself, but it gives you back more." When I finally stood to leave, they hugged me one by one, as if we had known each other far longer than a single might. The girl with the scarf pressed a folded napkin into my hand, her handwriting looping across it. Non dimenticare, don't forget. I carried those words with me as I walked back through the winding streets. The lamps burned low, the city still humming, and I realized I would remember this night not for the steps or the square, but for the way strangers had opened their circle to me, and in doing so, had given Rome a face I could never lose.
By my last full day in Rome, the city already felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Each street seemed sharper, each scent more vivid, as though my senses were trying to imprint everything before it vanished. I left my room early, determined not to waste a moment, and walked toward Campo dei Fiori, where the market was already alive with color and noise. The square smelled of spices and fresh herbs, basil and rosemary tied in bunches, garlic strings hanging like ornaments. Vendors shouted, their voices loud but warm, offering tastes on the edge of knives. I tried a slice of pecorino, its saltiness sharp on my tongue, followed by honey so sweet it felt like sunlight melting across my mouth. In the middle of the square, under the shadow of Giordano Bruno's statue, I sat with a small paper bag of cherries, their juice staining my fingers, as I watched life unfold. Children tugged impatiently at their mother's skirts, couples debated over which melon to buy, an old man whistled softly while weighing handfuls of olives. Rome in the morning was less frantic than at night, but no less alive. It was a rhythm that pulsed gently, reminding me that even the ordinary here was extraordinary. Later, I wandered back toward the Tiber, crossing one of its bridges where the water shimmered in the midday sun. I paused in the middle, leaning against the stone railing, and let the breeze carry away the heaviness that had been building inside me. Leaving was always like this. Excitement for what waited ahead, tangled with the ache of what would be left behind. Rome had given me its fire, its intimacy, its noise, and its silences. I wasn't ready to let it go. I found myself in a small trattoria for lunch, tucked down a street where the ivy draped low enough to brush my shoulders. The waiter, recognizing me from a previous visit, greeted me with a grin and placed bread and olive oil on the table before I had even spoken. The pasta that followed was simple, just cacio e pepe, but it felt like perfection. Pepper sharp against the creamy sauce, each bite grounding me in the present. When I asked for the check, the owner himself appeared, shaking his head. Un bicchiere di vino ancora, he insisted, pouring me another glass instead of letting me leave. I smiled, knowing this was Rome's way of saying goodbye, not with sadness, but with abundance. In the afternoon, I wandered to the Colosseum once more. This time, I didn't take photos or linger on history. I simply stood outside its walls, letting the shadow of its arches stretch over me. Around me, tourists snapped pictures, guides waved their flags, children begged for gelato. But in my heart, there was only stillness, a conversation between myself and the stones. You have survived, I thought, and in your survival, you remind me that endings are never really the end. As the sun lowered, I returned to Piazza Navona. Painters were still there, their canvases catching the last golden light. A street performer drew laughter from a small crowd, balancing impossibly on one hand. I bought another glass of wine from a corner stall and sat at the fountain's edge, notebook open on my lap. My pen moved quickly, trying to catch fragments before they slipped away. The roar of Vespas, the taste of cherries, the smile of a stranger offering me bread. By the time the lamps flickered on, I felt both full and hollow. Rome had filled me with more than I could carry, yet I still wanted more. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring another journey, northward into the mountains, into the stillness of Switzerland. But tonight, the city was mine.
My last night in Rome began the way all Roman nights seemed to begin, with noise. The air itself vibrated, thick with scents of roasted meat, fried dough, basil crushed fresh against mortar, and wine poured without hesitation. Lanterns swung above the piazzas, their light catching the spray of fountains, turning the water into molten silver. It should have felt like every other night I had lived here, but something in me shifted. The laughter sounded sharper, the music brighter, every detail edged with the bittersweet knowledge that I was hearing it for the last time, at least for now. I started in Campo de' Fori, the square glowing under strings of lights. Tables spilled onto the stones, pressed shoulder to shoulder, waiters weaving through the chaos with impossible balance. Friends toasted loudly, clinking glasses with such force it seemed they might shatter. A violin and guitar tangled their melodies near the fountain, their songs so raw and urgent that it made people stop mid-step, eyes wide, lips curved into smiles they hadn't planned. I stood at the edge, clutching a paper cup of red wine, feeling the music thread itself through me. From there,
I let myself be carried into the heart of the city, each turn pulling me deeper. In Piazza Nirvana, the fountains thundered, water roaring as though it too wanted to leave an impression before I departed. Painters still worked beneath the lamps, their strokes fast and confident, as if speed could capture the energy of the night. I bought a sketch of the fountain from a young artist, her hands stained with charcoal. She pressed it into my palms with a grin and said simply, "Ricordati," remember. The word landed heavy, as though Rome itself had spoken through her. I carried the sketch with me to the Spanish Steps, which were alive with bodies and voices. Students sprawled across the marble, bottles of wine resting between them, songs rising and falling in chorus. I found a spot among them, the stone cool under my palms, and let myself be absorbed into their circle. They welcomed me without question, offering me a sip from their bottle, teaching me fragments of songs I could barely follow. My laughter joins theirs, clumsy but real, and for a moment I forgot I was leaving. But when I leaned back and looked up at the stars above the floodlit rooftops, the weight of departure returned. The night was dazzling, yes, but it was dazzling because it was fleeting. Rome burned brighter precisely because I knew I wouldn't see it again tomorrow. Each cheer, each clink of glass, each strum of a guitar struck me with urgency, as if the city was pressing itself into me, demanding that I never forget. Later, I walked to the Trevi Fountain one last time. The crowd was thinner now, mostly locals lingering with cigarettes, couples kissing in the glow of water. I stood at the edge, the sound of rushing water filling my chest, and pulled a coin from my pocket. This time, I closed my eyes as I threw it, letting the wish form only as the splash echoed, not for luck, not even for return, but for memory, for Rome to live inside me even after I was gone. When I finally made my way back to my room, the streets were still alive, though softer, more frayed around the edges. My hair smelled of smoke, my clothes of wine, my lips still tingled with salt from the fountain spray. I placed the sketch beside the one from the night before, two fragile keepsakes of a city that had given me too much to hold. I leaned out the window one last time. Below, voices still rose, laughter still burst, music still wound itself through the air. Rome had not changed, but I had. And as I whispered my goodnight into the night, I realized that leaving would not erase it. Rome had carved itself into me, its roar, its tenderness, its fire, all of it mine to carry forward.
The morning of my departure from Rome arrived with a heaviness I hadn't felt in any other city. The bells rang out across the rooftops, solemn and slow, as if tolling only for me. My suitcase waited by the door, packed the night before, yet I lingered in the small room as though I might hold the city back by delaying a few minutes more. The walls smelled faintly of last night's wine and of my own tired perfume, but when I opened the shutters, Rome rushed in again. Warm air, the cry of a street vendor, the hiss of an espresso machine drifting up from the cafe below. Life here never paused, not even for goodbyes. Dragging my bag over the cobblestones, I retraced the streets that had carried me so many times. Past the trattoria, where the owner had insisted on pouring me another glass of wine instead of a bill. Past the piazza, where students had pulled me into their circle, their songs still echoing faintly in my ears. Past the fountains, whose spray had cooled my skin on hot afternoons, their voices murmuring endlessly like guardians of memory. Each corner whispered fragments of nights and mornings, weaving a tapestry I already knew I couldn't unravel. At Termini Station, the chaos swallowed me whole. People hurried in every direction, their voices sharp, their footsteps quick. Announcements rattled through the air in Italian first, then English, clipped and efficient.
I stood still for a moment in the center of it all, clutching my ticket, feeling the weight of leaving pressed down. Rome wasn't a place you simply departed. It was a place that lodged itself inside you, demanding that you carry it no matter where you went. I bought a small espresso from a crowded counter, the barista sliding it across without looking up. I drank it in 2 gulps, the bitterness sharp, the warmth grounding. Around me, families argued, tourists fumbled with maps, children tugged at their parents' hands. I felt both invisible and impossibly alive, as though I had been written into a play that would continue long after I exited the stage. When my platform was called, I boarded slowly, reluctant to cross the threshold. The train was sleek, its windows reflecting the blur of the station. I found my seat by the window, setting my suitcase in the rack and my notebook on my lap. Through the glass, I watched the arches and crowds dissolve into motion. A whistle blew, sharp and final, and the train shuddered into life. Rome began to slip away. The rooftops grew smaller, the domes and spires fading into the horizon. I pressed my palm lightly against the window, as if I could hold the city there, keep it from vanishing. But cities are not meant to be held. They are meant to change you, then release you. And Rome had done both. As the train carried me north, the landscape shifted. The colors softened, the land opening into rolling hills dotted with olive trees and vineyards. Beyond them, faint but certain, rose the shadows of mountains, the Alps. I thought of the stillness waiting there, the hush of snow, the echo of footsteps on a deserted platform, the steady rhythm of trains gliding through silence. Where Rome had been fire, Switzerland would be ice. Where Rome had demanded noise, Switzerland would offer pause. I opened my notebook and wrote one last line for Rome. To leave is not to lose. To carry is to honor. Then I closed it, letting the rumble of the train replace my thoughts. The city behind me still roared in my chest, but ahead stretched something else entirely. A journey through the mountains. A new rhythm to discover.